I think in the economic landscape, there's a kind of surprise at work, which is it looks to me as though the United States is on a pretty strong resurgent path, whereas almost all of the rest of the world is slowing down. So we've gone from thinking that the BRICS were the magic number. The BRICS are in big trouble, pretty much. There's this funny flip that just happened. And if you need customers, you're more likely to find those customers probably here in terms of having lots of money already on hand and in terms of having the advantage of being in a growth situation instead of a declining situation. But for most of the rest of the world, it's a declining situation. So within this, I'm just going to point out a few things which are more specific, which might be helpful. So as I said, the U.S. leads as the safest, strongest, most trusted economy in the world with dollar strength to prove it. China, it looks to me, is manufacturing its own containment. China often complains about the U.S. trying to contain China. But there's a lot going on right now in the world of equity markets, regulatory approval, banking, and so on, reverse mergers, going private again, and security, which are, I think, of China's own making. But it took a while for these things to come to maturity. So there was this other period of time where everybody was excited about how many gym shoes you could sell to 1.3 billion people, and we're all over that one now. But now the question is, what percentage of IPOs that were done for Chinese businesses are fraudulent? And you may have seen the SEC brought what are called administrative charges against all of the top 4 accounting firms, their Chinese branches, 2 days ago for this reason. And we're going to kind of see an increasing amount of this stuff where people are just going to question, are those the real numbers? Is that the real stuff? Is this really what it appears on the surface? So there's a limiting experience which is not made by us, but made by China themselves, as they, I would say, collide with the British Blackstone property law system. For most of the people in the inventing nations, you have this idea of your word is your bond, property law matters, a contract is a contract, you got to stay by it. And this is just not the culture or the background legally that those folks come from. So there is obviously going to be a clash just because of the differences in the cultures and in the legal histories of those countries. But that clash is happening now. And how that gets worked out will depend almost entirely, I think, on the Chinese. In other words, I don't think the SEC is going to change. I really don't think we're going to allow fraud on the equity markets in Canada and the United States. So if this is going to get resolved, it'll have to get resolved in some way by the Chinese deciding that in order to have the export picture they want, they'll need to change some things and be better at accounting, be better at truth-telling in terms of contracts and so forth, and do that right. You've heard speeches by Hillary Clinton and by our president on the very subject. You've seen a real battle where we are trying to get a treaty called TPP, and China secretly put together a different treaty with no requirements for rules. I forget the name of it, but it's all the ASEAN members and China, unlike the TPP, which was all the ASEAN members without China. So there's a pitched battle going on over this issue, and it will affect how China and the world, not just the U.S., work with each other. And I actually seriously hope that this becomes something which China recognizes itself and modifies some of these many decades-long behaviors so that it can, in fact, be a great trading partner in the future. And that could happen, but this is probably the first set of things that are going to happen that the Chinese will really pay attention to. Russia, I had a really short line about Russia. Now things get really scary. Every time Mr. Putin does something new, it just scares me a little more. And I keep thinking, well, that's the end of that behavior. But no, he wants to do one. So having gotten rid of democracy, basically, having made all governorships by fiat instead of by vote, having taken complete control of the media, having just passed new laws that are kind of like sudden death for you if you say something nasty about Vladimir, it just goes on. And I don't know how that's going to play out, but I think Russia is on such a downward spiral in terms of where they need to be, where they need to go, that just having resources and oil isn't enough. And that's his play. I've got the money, screw you. But in fact, I think the Russian people are nervous about all this. As much as they have always loved Putin, they're at a point where things have changed qualitatively. And that happened when he took over again. There was a shift there that was palpable, I think, on the streets of Moscow. So we'll see. But I don't think Vlad gets it. And so there's a very unstable situation in my mind, and not a happy story if you're Russian or trading with Russia. Post-communist nations are in a really interesting situation, and this is true for Putin, it's also true for China. The crisis is one of not having a unifying principle. The biggest problem in Russia, if you ask Putin tonight, is that problem. And that's what he's spending all of his time on. There is no unifying principle to what is a Russian. Why am I a Russian? Why would I be patriotic? What is it about Russia that I'm working for? It's not religious, it's not economic, it's Vlad on a horse or scuba diving. So, you know, the kind of ironic aftertaste of having had communist government, top-down government, is that you don't have this unifying principle that everybody has in their pocket and that allows them to work harder and harder for less and less money when they need to. And the same thing is being worried about greatly by the Standing Committee in China. They know, and it's a big, big problem. Their number one goal has always been, and still is, stable government, a stable, continued ruling by their party. And it is most threatened by this one problem, that if you're not going to be Confucian, if you're not going to be communist, if you're not, what are you going to be? What is it that will hold you all together and make you feel proud to be Chinese? And until they discover what that is, they are at risk. So I think that both of the post-communist big nations are quietly looking for these things, and you'll see it if you watch them. Japan goes ultranationalist with Ishihara greasing the skids. So this is happening. I don't know if words are required. Japan is obviously going to be much more conservative, much more military than they were before. I fully expect them to change their constitution back into being not defense only. India, progress in small steps. And then we come to the UK and our guest this evening. And my only thought about the UK is pretty simple. It was Cambridge in, Cameron out. So Cambridge, and I'm not saying this because we have guests tonight from Pembroke, but Cambridge has become a really bright, shining light in science and technology. They're doing amazing things. And I think that the UK really has a place on the world stage through Cambridge and some related universities that it maybe didn't really have 10 years ago. So that's wildly great. And it strikes me that the PM has made enough missteps in the last 6 months that his own support in his own party is eroding and that he may be at risk. Indonesia, a moderate growth story, just as is Peru. Cambodia, now the new role as a China proxy or puppet. And if you're watching the TPP story, if you're watching the ASEAN meetings, Cambodia appears now to be almost completely under Chinese control. Every vote, it kind of reminds me of what we see in the UN when Israel and the United States do something. So every vote will be the same. Cambodia will only vote with China. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's something new. Singapore's aspirations to outpace Hong Kong become more real. This is kind of interesting. Singapore has always wanted to be Hong Kong. And I think they have a better chance now than they had 5 years ago. And last but not least, Oz and Brazil, Oz being Australia, suffer in their China embrace while Canada continues its quiet, boring, nice, lucrative, oh-so-Canadian walk in the park. So Australia, as you know, is suffering right now. Brazil's been kind of fascinating. Australia, well documented, but Brazil, when China becomes your best trading partner, several things happen at once. The first thing that happens is your currency goes wumpus because they're manipulating currency against you. And we saw the Brazilian real lose 34, 37% in the first year of that friendship. And it's not necessarily obvious to the people who run the country that that's the cause of this or what they should do. So the second thing that happens is a lot of your small business people go out of business while cheap goods, a la Walmart in the United States, come flooding into that country. And so you're seeing a reduction in those businesses, and that's a big problem. And so now we have Rousseff in Brazil trying to legislate the protection of small companies. Well, that's interesting, but why go through this exercise at all? So every time you see what I would call a deathly embrace between a major mercantilist nation whose only goal in trading is to have asymmetry in trade, to export more to you than they import from you. As that embrace closes, these things happen, and it's instructive, and it's tough if you're in those countries. So last but not least, economically, it strikes me that GDP in country landscapes, just as currency, forex values, GDP is no longer the driving factor or even the trailing indicator. IP wealth really is what matters. The creation, transfer, and use of IP are what define national economic health. If you want to understand a nation and its future in terms of wealth, don't look at its GDP numbers because they're probably fake. Look instead at how its universities are doing. And look instead at how the Silicon Valleys of that country are doing. Who's inventing things? How many companies are being created? These are the things that will really tell you whether wealth is going to be created or not. On the technology landscape, we have something which readers of SNS already know about, I'll apologize ahead of time, which I'm calling the Great Contest. So I've now got a completely different view of economics than I had 5 years ago, and it's so simple. There are inventing nations and nations that take those inventions. In both cases, they understand exactly the value of the IP. IP creates wealth. The only question is, which kind of dog are you? You know, there's a white dog and a black dog, or whatever, however you want to call it. So the entire globe, if you look at it from the perspective of tech people, isn't about foreign exchange rates. It's not about who's got the money. It's not about demographics. All those things that most economists from the Chicago School would plug into a model somewhere, to me, are completely unimportant. It's only about IP. If you're a nation that's inventing many more things, you're going to be rich. If you're a nation that is stealing those inventions effectively and making money on them, you're going to be rich. There are a lot of ways to use IP, but the one thing you can't do is not have it, not have access to it, and not make money from it. Then you're not going to be rich. So literally, I think the world is painted in two colors, and one color is called we invent things, and the other color is called we copy those inventions. And it is, for me, a great contest, and one can only hope that the inventors, in some numeric way, prevail. We'll never get rid of copying, but we need to have enough freedom to invent in terms of return on investment so that we can keep doing it. And that's really the struggle. Now, for those of you who are interested in past performance, you've all seen the fine print on stock sales. So what we're going to do is we're going to put up all the calls from last year on our website, together with some lame thoughts from me about why I did so horribly well this year. And if you disagree, I would like you to write in, because this is what we do. And I don't think anybody else does this. I don't know anybody who grades their stuff publicly. So we're going to do this. I'd love to hear from you. If it makes sense, we'll post your comments. And I'll just give you the summary at the moment, which I do every year. So from the past 6 years of doing what we're doing here, we had 94%. I had now 2012. Last year's score was 98. If you do all the math, as Clinton would say, you get 94.6. So I'm edging back toward where I started about 10 years ago, which was 94.75, and if I just behave myself, I'll get there again sometime soon. And now for the predictions. And as you know, I just read these out because, sure enough, just like I just said, we'll be arguing about this in a year, and if I vary them at all, that's not going to work. So what I'll do is I'll just read them, and then we can have a conversation after that about whether they're right or wrong or anything you want. So number one, carry-alongs dominate global computer markets. So Sir Richard, we were talking about this. We wrote about carry-alongs in 1997, and at that point said that it would become the biggest computer category ever. Apple was kind enough to make one, the iPad, about 8 years later. And so today, I'm saying that in this year, we now will have that come true. We're going to have carry-alongs become the most large category in all of computing. This category of pads and slates takes its rightful place as the largest market segment of computing devices. Already the fastest growing category for several years, the format and dominant market position comes to pass in 2013. Number two, and my apologies ahead of time to those involved, Intel. Long live the king is dead. The chip royalty ladder is flipped as Intel becomes increasingly irrelevant in the world of general computing, while carry-along and mobile chip makers led by Qualcomm and ARM are the new William and Kate. For most observers, Intel in 2013 is a component supplier for servers. The best way out of this cul-de-sac would be a new CEO with tech chops. Number three, Net TV dominates. Majority of US-based homes will have net-connected televisions, with other developed nations quickly following as bandwidth allows. This change in distribution will begin to affect production in new and interesting ways, leading to more and cheaper content of increasingly varying length and format. The straitjacket of old TV slots, ads, and schedules is now off. And I'll add that I would not want to be in the cable business even if you paid me. Number four, the LTE versus fiber battle creates regional revolutions in broadband. Customers choosing LTE, long-term evolution, in DSL-served regions will be paying more and getting more. But those choosing LTE in fiber-served regions will be paying more for wireless broadband but getting less. The LTE versus fiber fight will define the telecom's business model battle for the coming decade, with LTE speeds scheduled to exceed cable and DSL, wired speeds for many users. The question of price per megabit will be inverted. Is this about mobility or megabits per second? This is the start of real revolutions in broadband pricing and provision. Number five, Google gets its mojo back. Facebook is tired and nosy. Apple is Steveless. Microsoft is Microsoft. And Amazon is the only other game in town. Google's efforts in email, video, smartphones, maps, and driverless cars open up new long-term expansion paths with more to follow. With all its many failures, the company has proven it can find and plow new turf. In terms of creativity, Google becomes the next Apple. Now it must learn about product support or risk losing it all to competitors. Number 6, the driverless car becomes a serious and competitive global project. With multiple new states and countries passing laws to allow it, and major brands undertaking serious development of all the features that will one day lead to common acceptance. And I wanted to mention that I wrote this down before Volvo announced their own driverless car project on December 3rd. Number 7, ebooks are the books. Total ebook sales in dollars will beat adult paperback sales this year in 2013. And their differential growth rates will exceed 30% as ebooks continue their ramp toward dominating the entire book market. Number 8, enterprise IT struggles to achieve very modest gains with executive purchase decisions captured between large cash hoards, increased Asian competition, and their own poorly performing customers. Although big data is the marketing cry, vendors in this market will find a general reluctance to spend. 2013 looks like another defensive year, except for the security segment, with no serious enterprise Windows 8 adoption and not much else going on. The screws are already battened down. Number 9, hacktivist efforts acquire an important and permanent role in political transparency, moving from the level of annoyance to becoming an important long-term part of the international political and security landscape. Nations and leaders hoping to hide the truth from their constituents will have to give up this option, paving the way for a new era in reluctantly open governments. And number 10, supply chain security becomes a major factor in global technology purchases. Starting with the high security risk offerings from Huawei, the feeling of cyber unease on the part of inventing nations grows and has a material effect on vendor market share among countries which can afford to prioritize their infrastructure security over short-term price advantage. Recognition that today's supply chains are virtually all compromised will lead to plant relocations and a new set of business opportunities for onshore component makers. And I'll mention that this was written before Apple's announcement today of onshoring some of their iMac production. So that's that.